Afternoon all. I thought we should try and look at the remaining decisive games not covered on this channel yet from the Tal Memorial, because it was the sort of strongest tournament of the year basically up until that point. So this was on the 18th of November. Ivanchuk, playing white, played e4, and we get a lesson in how to play solidly with black. Now, sometimes, take Tal's opponents playing Sicilian, getting, hack attacked, smashed with king safety. Maybe, a lesser evil is to present the opponent with weaknesses which, theoretically look like weaknesses, but in practice are difficult to exploit. And that's a very, big key difference. And I think it's symbolic, in a way, of this whole system that Levon plays, the Russian system. We see this early, after bishop b5, not the classic royal pairs, a6 move, but the very early knight f6, attacking white's centre pawn. And the idea really is black is not minding in this system the exchange of queens. If the king is inconvenienced and having to move back, without the queens on the board, it's less of an exploitable weakness having a king in the centre. And I think that's one of the main points of playing this variation. So, maybe, the club players should put this as part of their repertoire for the solid choices when they want to play solidly against someone, especially a dangerous attacking player like Vassily Ivanchuk. It's probably a very good choice. So, Ivanchuk castles, he doesn't like go into any side lines. This is like the main line, like Russian system. So, knight takes e4, and white plays d4. And now we play this forcing move knight d6, which basically is leading to an exchange of queens, because white's about to take here, knight f5, and the queens are going to come off. So we're left with this kind of apparent weakness of the king in the centre, but with the queens off and the pawn on e5 being a shield for the black king on e8 often, this isn't such a big problem. So this is what happens now. Bishop takes c6, d takes e5, so leaving a shield on the e file. That pawn is actually useful to blockade. Knight f5, and now the queens are taken off. So this is the point where you might think, doesn't this kind of violate a rule that you might have had about, the king castling? It doesn't really matter here, because as I say, this pawn's a shield. This is a very solid system. Black also has the two bishops, which is like a common thing with, say, the Sicilian Sveshnikov. Picking up the bishop pair is nice. But here, this light square bishop's got a nice blockade square. And instead of black having a gaping hole on d5, these double pawns, which are another apparent weakness along with the king, they serve a useful purpose as well. This pawn usefully eyes d5. So all in all, these two apparent weaknesses are difficult to exploit. There's a big difference between theory and practice. And I know we've seen on this channel, past videos of Judith Polgar beating this system, but she had to be very resourceful. She had to sometimes undouble these pawns to get access to weaknesses, because sometimes this pawn is like defending key squares. So it's difficult to beat this system because these weaknesses are not that exploitable. So knight c3 now from Vassily, and king e8. Especially white without the light squared bishop, and with this pawn on e5, which is quite easy often to blockade. This knight is also a very useful, usefully placed knight. And if white, tries to kick it with g4, that's often, very difficult to arrange, because black can often prevent g4 by playing a move like h5. So all in all, this is very tricky, this system, for white to get a tangible advantage. I think a book's been written by an international master that I played in the Classic last year. John Cox, COX, has written a book if you want to play the system for black. So really the exploitable weaknesses are a few. The apparent weaknesses, there's at least two apparent weaknesses, the king in the centre and the double pawn complex. In return, we've got a strong knight and we've got the bishop pair. So h3 and now h5, preventing really g4. So h3 is just left as a way of just maybe giving the king some air in potential endings, because actually for G4 it's not that particularly useful at the moment. And it also weakens a bit the G3 square. So if white ever plays F3, that G3 can be sealed even more maybe if black plays H4. That's another positional theme, I think, with this opening. Bishop F4. Now Bishop D7. Sometimes the king in this opening actually ventures over on the queen side with but here, you know, on E8 is an alternative. Bishop D7 might in the future imply that C5 and Bishop C6 might be on the cards. Rook AD1, Rook D8. But for the moment, there's no need to commit to anything, to any pawn move. It will just be weakening D5 at the moment. The pawn's useful on C6, just eyeing and keeping control of, you know, two squares. Otherwise, this knight on C3 is ready to pounce, really, to either D5 or B5. So B3 now, which often supports later knight E4 and C4. Okay, so Bishop E7, Rook FE1, Bishop B4. Downside of B3 is that this is now a forcing move. Bishop retreats back. Bishop C8. It's no big deal for the moment. And now an exchange of dark square bishops. So what do we have here? Does black really want to exchange off the bishop pair? What are the dark square weaknesses? Well, white's got also dark square weaknesses, you know, especially that B3 move. There's dark square weaknesses. Potentially there's a dark square weakness here because of this H3 move. So both sides are will be weaker on the dark square as a result of this bishop exchange. Now knight E7. Okay, and we have some delicate manoeuvring here, which takes the solid position we have with seemingly few winning chances for black. That's the problem with this system. And without the bishop pair, so if you might think, well, an ending is going to favour white surely with these double pawns, because white potentially maybe can create in the future, you know, a passed pawn on this side if the pawn majority here is not as effective to create a passed pawn as white's 4-3 over here. Well, maybe it was because of some sort of high level consideration that it seems Vassily was tempted in this game to weaken some pawns unnecessarily. Now it may have to do with this underlying scenario of the 4-3. I'm not particularly sure, but there's some provocative knight moves here, like a knight's dance now from Levon we're about to witness, because this knight now goes to D5. Okay, so it was on F5, then it's gone to E7, now it's going to D5. Now the king goes to E7, possibly, you know, celebrating, you know, where is white's dark square bishop? There's no dark square bishop to play a check. Okay, but also the rooks are now connected. Hi there, and the rook can maybe go there, or even as an option. But I don't think that's really the purpose of king E7. But white plays a curious move now, actually. Vassily plays F3, which obviously weakens G3 a bit more, and maybe makes H4 a bit more tempting. Now, is one downside of playing H4 that this pawn's actually going to be a bit weak on H4? But how is white going to arrange an attack on H4? Maybe Rook D4 at some point? Or maybe the idea is King F2, just to bring in the king to the centre, and maybe something like this. So it's interesting what the idea of F3 was. But whatever it was, H4 does seem to intuitively seal the dark square G3 a little bit more, preventing G4, because now the en passant mechanism will come into play. So it's restraints on the king side, but also actually the rook is further activated and can potentially use H5 or even H6 here. The king does indeed come to F2, which shows some reason evidently for playing F3, but now Rook H5. And all of a sudden, there's this idea that this pawn might actually be a weakness. Especially, you know, for example, B5. If knight A5 wasn't possible coming in to C6, say, then E5 might actually be potentially weak. White plays Rook D2, and now Rook E8, further sort of seemingly ganging up on E5, as though one day it's going to be weak. Knight D4, and the king goes back to F8. So this king's also been a little bit cheeky with its manoeuvres. So we have some strange manoeuvres going on by Levon, which seem to just kill a bit of time, as though a draw's on the cards. a4, as though b5 was actually a serious threat there. Maybe it was now, because knight a5, maybe rook takes e5 was on the cards, allowing c6 to drop, potentially. So a6, as though again, maybe c5 and then b5 might be on the cards, or b5 and then c5. And this was actually sealed in the same way that black is sealing against g4. Now white tries to play the same way on the other side with a5. So both sides are sealing each other's pawn opportunities, restraints on the pawn structure on both sides of the board. So the rooks are both kind of pointing across the centre. This one rather strangely from h5, but again a central square. The two knights here seem a little bit more active, or do they? Because this knight's at least equal to this one. This bishop's still got a nice diagonal, and it's got a target on h3. So it's difficult to kind of assess this position as being better for either side for the moment. But we see this strange move knight b4, which again seems to mark time, because what is it doing here on b4? It's not really threatening anything. Okay, it's holding down the rook on d2, but apart from that, is it actually doing much? Knight e2, knowing that b5 is answerable with en passant now, so the e5 is being held by just the knight on c4. The knight goes back to d5 as if, is it going to be a draw or something? This knight goes back. Now the knight goes back to e7. So it's a real knight's dance here. And maybe this is not everyone's cup of tea to play with black. But, you know, if you're a professional player at 2800 and you don't want to be hacked in the black side of a Sicilian defence, maybe this is kind of a very useful style to have, because no real exploitable weakness were presented to the opponent at any stage during this game, really. The king, okay, with the exchange of queens and the king in the centre, it's now sort of safe anyway on f8. And black had two bishops, which was given up now. Okay, the one sort of real concern maybe the double pawns. But other than that, black also has a very firm control of f5. And a fundamental weakness with the pawn on e5 is that sometimes these two squares, you know, are more vulnerable. So black does have a nice grip on f5, and in fact I think f5 as a blockade is one of Aronian's favourites. I was checking out something on YouTube, the post-conference analysis with his game against Necker, and he was emphasising f5 in many key variations when they were doing a post-mortem analysis. I think this is Aronian's cup of tea, to have restraints on white's pawn structure in a comfortable looking solid position where the opponent really can't do much. So rook e4. And now we have another strange, seemingly time-marking move, basically, rook h6, as though maybe it's designed against e6. But if e6 was indeed possible, it could have been played here by white. So I think e6 was readily answerable with f6. No, let's not bother doing an engine check there. Let's get on here. So rook e4, rook h6. And now I don't know if it's frustration or this underlying context that white has this pawn majority. But this f5, given the strength of black's control of f5, maybe a draw after should have been proposed here to find out if black's really playing for a win. But instead we have a committal pawn move again. f4, which I'm not really sure the future of f4, because, you know, black's already got a firm grip on f5. This pawn potential, you know, creation of a pass pawn is not really going to happen with this pawn gripping basically both of these pawns because of the en passant mechanism. There's good restraints on g3 and on f5 here. How can white possibly make progress? So this knight starts to dance again with knight d5, as though the weakness of the last move implies that f5 might be a move on the cards for white. But is that really the case? Isn't that pawn on f5 going to be weak anyway, even if the knight momentarily is not on f5? I think the whole of black's play is leading to a kind of frustration for white. If white's really playing for a win, how does white achieve that against this very solid Russian system? So king f3. Okay, No big deal, you might say, but rook g6 does now threaten actually rook g3 check, potentially, which might be useful. But Ivanchuk, he's also tempted with maybe, I don't know, this is such speculation now, with the idea that f5 is more attractive because it's with tempo. But it's a very committal pawn move to play f5. Just because the knight's, temporarily being released from f5 and the rook's offering itself as a tempo gain does not mean f5 is good. Even if white in theory has this pawn majority, black's control and grip on key squares on this side of the board is clearly evident. So f5 is for some reason played, and now we get a very big question mark over are these two pawns on f5 and e5 a strength or a liability? The rook simply goes to h6, and we've got immediate mechanisms here for the knight, to come back to just attack f5 without this guy being able to support it now because of the en passant mechanism. So is f5 actually weak? Well, we see now after rook e1 that here black dares to loosen control of d5 by playing this move c5 now, chasing that central knight away from protecting f5. So there's a reason for taking this risk. Okay, now I'm not sure there's a useful move other than knight e2 here to expose an attack on d5. If we just engine check this position just to make sure, it seems black has grasped an advantage here. It seems from an engine point of view, technically an advantage. So I don't think it likes the look of these two pawns here. There's no real alternative, I think. Knight c6 just takes and protecting the knight on d5. Knight b5 just takes and attacks that. There's no option for the knight apart from knight e2. And now these two pawns, particularly the one on f5, it's now pounced on with knight e7. Without a defensive knight now on d4, isn't f5 simply going to drop off here? Well, I don't know if it becomes a kind of virtual pawn sack. White plays knight f4. I don't know if there was anything better for Ivanchuk here. If we looked at that valuation before, it seems to be less than a pawn though. So what's going on here after knight f4? Knight takes f5. Now it's like half a pawn. So has white got big compensation in the form of this d5 square? Because that c5 did weaken d5. Perhaps because knight d5 is coming into the picture here. So maybe that's the small compensation that white gets. This control of d5, because black had to play c5 to dislodge the defensive knight. So c3 was played here. And now knight e7, as though maybe the knight is going to make use of c6, because that was another benefit of c5, vacating c6, and that will provide a frontal attack on this pawn. So is this the time, or should have white have considered playing knight d5 there instead of c3? Perhaps he's going downhill here just to make sure. What would have been the best move for white here? Knight d5 does come on the radar, with the answer being rook, knight d4 check or rook c6. Well, either exchangeable, because now rook c6, and it seems as though black's holding on here with half a pawn advantage from a theoretical engine point of view. So maybe that's why there was a slight miscalculation or something about the d5 square. So this rook's been very resourceful actually in all this, being able to swing across the c6 if needed to protect the poor c7 pawn, because that c5 did weaken that d5 square. So anyway, so black seems to have wrenched out a pawn, and is it going to be torture time or not? Now knight g6, knight d3, which does raise a question about c5 now, because it's difficult to defend c5 because of this restraint. Bishop e6 offering up c5, because now e5 is going to be weak. A chain reaction, just taking and then taking on e5, and with check. What's this king doing there? Rook e1, rook h5. Again, now e5 becomes the next victim on the e file. King f2, check, and now forceful exchange, and now winning e5. So it seems black has munched up. Those two pawns have gone. Those two proud pawns on f5 and e5 now disappeared. So we have here, you know, strong, solid positional opening, leading to some provocation, leading to these two pawns somehow being taken away from white, and white drifting into a bad ending basically now. So f6, rook e4, hitting h4, b6 protecting c5 though, because if rook takes h4, that's I think a tactical disaster. Knight f3 check, or is it? No, the knight's on d3. No, just knight takes d3. Pardon me. These two rooks are pinning this rook, so knight d3 will be on if rook takes h4. A takes b, c takes. Okay. Now actually, no, rook takes h4 is on. Pardon me. Knight takes d3. Ah, there's a counter tactic here. Check to win the rook. That's why rook takes h4 is possible. But still, Aronian hasn't lost control of the position. He's a pawn up, and he can do something about rook h8 here. And these pawns are not particularly pretty. There's a potential outside past a pawn. He covers up h8 now and invites an exchange of rooks. Knight g6, hitting the rook on h4, protecting h8. These rooks are challenging each other. So an exchange of rooks now ensues after rook e4. So we have a simplified ending where black is simply better. So knight e5 offering exchange of knights. Exchange of knights and a bad rook and pawn ending basically. So a5 marching down that past a pawn, and the black king coming aggressively into the position to f4, and now after a3 white resigned. So in many ways it was a very solid provocative game from black, with any weaknesses when presented were more of a theoretical nature rather than exploitable nature in practice. So from a theoretical nature, from the way it looks, you know, the way double pawns looks or the king in the center looks, doesn't mean they're actually easy to exploit. So let's have a look at this game in overview and summary. So this is the very ultra solid Russian system. This is a system I didn't dare to play against John Cox in last year's classic because he'd written a book against it. And from the evidence of this game, some of my intuitive fears are right, that sometimes it's very difficult, unless you have a particular system in mind, to grind out any advantage against this system. If Ivanchuk can't do it, what hope is there for the rest of us? I guess we can review the Judith Polgar wins earlier in the year, which maybe dented some confidence in this line as black. But otherwise it seems to be a very reliable weapon with this philosophy of presenting only kind of theoretical looking weaknesses. So the double pawns and the king in the centre, but black's got two bishops, nice restraints on the kingside pawns, where white's unable really to realise the pawn majority that easily on the other side of the board. And it seems here that Ivanchuk was somehow tempted eventually to put pawns on e5 and f5, adjacent pawns, which, although okay, that they look as though they might be threatening something to have those adjacent pawns. But if black really has this option of playing c5 and knight e7 for f5 to be severely challenged like it was now, there's a slight downside for the d5 square being weakened. So a manoeuvre like this is going to hit c7. But if black's got resources like rook c6, it seems this c5 and knight e7 mechanism is powerful. So maybe knight d5, rook c6 is okay. And black now can target the other pawn and just transpose into a better ending, basically, from all this. So, very solid performance with black. And of course, Aronian did very, very well in this tournament. He basically got an equal score with Magnus Carlsen. It was only on tie-break rules that he came apparently second to Magnus Carlsen. So this is one of his wins. I hope you got something from it, something about solidness and provocation and presenting only theoretical weaknesses rather than exploitable weaknesses. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.